Welcome to Craving the Heat, where desire takes the lead and every story leaves you wanting more. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments and keep up with our latest naughty stories. The first time I met Adrian Cole, I had no idea that a single recording session would turn into the most complicated chapter of my life. I had been running my podcast, Hidden Truths, for nearly 3 years. It was a passion project that had grown into something more, a space where I could explore stories of human resilience, secrets, betrayals, and redemption. I was married to Michael, a man who had once been the love of my life, though somewhere between his long business trips and my late-night editing sessions, our marriage had become a quiet arrangement. We still kissed each other goodbye in the mornings, still shared the same bed at night, but the warmth was gone. What remained was routine. Adrian wasn't just any guest. He was a well-known journalist, someone who had built a reputation on uncovering the kind of scandals that shook entire industries. He had charisma, an easy smile, and a way of making even the most guarded people open up. I had admired his work from afar, never imagining he'd actually accept my invitation to appear on the show. When his assistant confirmed he'd be coming to my small home studio, my heart raced in a way it hadn't in a long time. The afternoon he arrived, rain pattered softly against the windows, and I felt oddly nervous as I adjusted my notes. When I opened the door, he was standing there in a dark coat, his hair damp from the drizzle, his eyes sharp but kind. He carried an energy that filled the room before he even spoke. We sat across from each other in my small recording space, microphones between us, but soon I forgot about the equipment. His voice had a warmth that wrapped around every word. He spoke about his latest investigation, about the personal cost of truth, about the loneliness of chasing stories that no one else dared to touch. There were moments when his eyes met mine, holding them longer than necessary, as if he was letting me see the man behind the headlines. I stared at it for hours before responding. I wanted to delete it, to pretend it had never come, but my fingers typed out a reply before my conscience could stop them. Just coffee. We met at a quiet cafe outside of town, a place where neither of us would be recognized. The moment I saw him sitting there, waiting for me, that same rush of heat spread through my chest. He smiled when our eyes met, and it was like the night we shared had been a mistake, but the beginning of something we weren't ready to name. Our conversation was easy, like it had been before, but underneath it ran a current we both felt. When his hand brushed mine across the table, I didn't pull away. The truth was, I didn't want to. And when he walked me back to my car, we didn't even pretend to resist. His mouth was on mine again, hungry, desperate, pulling me into a world that was no longer just about guilt. It was about need. What started as one night became a string of stolen hours, secret meetings hidden between the folds of our daily lives. Sometimes it was a hotel room where we didn't have to pretend. Sometimes it was just the back seat of his car, parked in an alley where no one would see. Every time it was reckless, and every time it was impossible to stop doubt with him, I was alive in a way I hadn't been in years. He made me laugh, made me feel wanted, made me believe that maybe love wasn't meant to be quiet and practical, but fiery and terrifying. Yet every time I slipped back into my house, into Michael's world, the weight of what I was doing crashed down on me. My husband still asked no questions. He still worked late, still scrolled through his phone, still let the silence fill the space between us. And that silence gave me permission, in its own twisted way, to keep going. When the recording stopped, silence lingered. We sat there, the soft hum of the rain in the background, and for some reason, I didn't want him to leave. He leaned back in his chair, studying me, his expression less guarded than before. "You're a better listener than most interviewers I've ever had," he said softly. I smiled, my fingers tracing the edge of my notepad. Maybe that's because I'm not just looking for answers. I'm looking for pieces of a person. His gaze deepened, and something unspoken passed between us. He asked if I wanted to grab a drink, just to unwind after such an intense conversation. Normally, I would have said no, I had dinner to make, emails to answer, a husband waiting somewhere in the distance of my life. But that night, The thought of returning to the silence of my marriage felt unbearable. We ended up at a small bar tucked away on a quiet street. The lights were low, the air filled with jazz and murmurs of other conversations. Adrian ordered whiskey. I asked for wine. At first, we talked about his work, my podcast, the nature of storytelling. But soon, the conversation slipped into more. Personal waters, our fears, our regrets. The parts of ourselves we rarely confess to others. He told me about a failed marriage, about the way his job had consumed him, about the ache of being both admired and utterly alone. I told him about Michael, about the way we'd stopped trying somewhere along the way, about the empty spaces that no amount of routine could fill. You deserve more than silence. Adrian said, his hand brushing mine on the table. The touch was light, almost accidental, but it sent a current through me. I should have pulled back. I should have reminded myself of the vows I'd made, the ring on my finger, the life I had built. But instead, I let the moment linger. His hand didn't move away, and neither did mine dot by the time we left the bar. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the city lights. We walked side by side, the air heavy with everything unspoken. When we reached my car, I turned to say goodbye, but he was closer than I expected, his eyes searching mine for permission. And before I could think, his lips were on mine. The kiss was slow, deliberate, filled with all the things we hadn't said. It was wrong. Every nerve in my body screamed that it was wrong, but it also felt achingly alive. When we finally pulled away, I was breathless, my heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his forehead resting against mine. But I didn't. I couldn't. What happened after wasn't for air. It wasn't for the podcast or the listeners or anyone else. It was for us, in the quiet shadows of a night neither of us had planned. We ended up in his hotel room where the lines between right and wrong blurred into nothing. The way he touched me was different, tender yet consuming, as if he saw every part of me I had hidden from the world. For one night, I wasn't a wife or a host or a woman bound by obligations. I was simply me, and he wanted me as I was. The morning after, reality returned like a cold draft. I lay in tangled sheets, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing beside me, and felt both guilty and alive in equal measure. He stirred, his arm tightening around me, and whispered, "We both know this can't last." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. He was right. But as I looked at him, at the man who had been just a guest a day before and now felt like something so much more, I couldn't help but wish it could. From that day forward, the podcast episode became one of my most downloaded, praised for its raw honesty and depth. But no one, not the listeners, not Michael, not the world, would ever know what really happened when the microphones turned off. It wasn't just an interview. It was a confession. It was a collision of two lonely souls who found each other for a fleeting moment, in a space where secrets became stories, and stories became something we couldn't ever tell aloud. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions. I returned home to Michael, who was sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through his phone, dinner reheated in the microwave waiting for me. He asked how the recording went, his voice absent-minded, his eyes never really meeting mine. I gave him a simple answer. It was good, and that was all. He didn't press, didn't notice the way my hands trembled as I picked at the food, didn't see the guilt that was eating at me. Or maybe he did, but chose not to care. That silence between us felt louder than ever, but Adrian lingered in my thoughts. His words, his touch, the way his eyes had searched mine as if he saw the pieces of me I had buried. I told myself it was a mistake, that it was just one night, an escape from the monotony of my marriage, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. Something had been awakened, something I couldn't put back to sleep. A week later, an email came from him. It wasn't long, just a thank you for the episode, a note about how much he admired the way I drew truth out of people. But at the bottom, there was a line that made my heart stop. "I can't stop thinking about you. Coffee." But guilt is a strange thing. It doesn't always stop you, it just sits inside you, festering. waiting for the moment it decides to destroy you. One evening, after another meeting with Adrian, I came home late. My hair was tousled, my shirt slightly wrinkled, and I was sure Michael would notice. But when I walked in, he was asleep on the couch, a half-finished glass of whiskey on the table beside him. I stood there staring at him, wondering how he had gotten here, how I had become a wife who carried the taste of another man on her lips, while her husband slept alone. I thought about ending it, about telling Adrian that whatever this was had to stop before it burned everything down. But the next time I heard his voice on the phone, low and warm, saying my name like it was something worth holding, I knew I wouldn't. What we had wasn't just lust. It was something deeper, something dangerous. It was late-night conversations about the kind of lives we wished we'd lived, laughter that felt like confession, touches that said more than words ever could. And the more I gave into it, the more impossible it became to imagine going back to the way things had been before. I knew it couldn't last. Affairs never do. But in those moments with him, I didn't care. The world narrowed down to the space. Between us, and in that space, I wasn't a woman bound by a loveless marriage or weighed down by expectations. I was just me. And he wanted me dot. It terrified me how much I needed that dot Michael began to notice in the smallest of ways, though at first he said nothing. The scent of perfume that wasn't the one he remembered, the faint traces of lipstick smudged at odd hours, the way my eyes seemed to be somewhere else, even when I was sitting across from him. He wasn't a fool, but he was a man who had grown, used to silence, to a marriage that had long ago shifted from intimacy to routine. For a while, I convinced myself he didn't care. And that gave me the freedom to keep slipping away into Adrian's arms. Adrian was dangerous for me in every way. He became more than just the stolen hours. He began to slip into my life with text messages that lit up my phone at midnight, with calls that stretched into the early morning, with little notes tucked into my bag when he managed to see me between recordings. He knew I was tangled in a marriage that was falling apart, and he didn't push, but he also didn't let me go. With him, I was no longer invisible. His eyes found me, saw me, pulled me out of the numbness I had been living in, but guilt never stopped whispering. One night, as I lay in bed beside Michael, I reached out instinctively, touching his hand in the dark. He stirred, opened his eyes, and for a second there was something raw there, an ache I hadn't seen in years. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly, his voice rough with sleep and whiskey. The question froze me. I wanted to lie, to say yes, but instead I said nothing because silence felt safer than betraying the truth. His eyes lingered on me before he rolled over, turning his back, and the weight of that unspoken answer pressed on my chest like a stone. Adrian, meanwhile, began to want more. He told me about the loneliness of his own life, about how he had left a relationship years ago that had broken him, how he was terrified of giving himself to someone again, but couldn't help it with me. When he kissed me, it wasn't just hunger, it was possession, devotion, a plea. He wanted me to choose him. And though I never said the words, part of me already had. The lies grew heavier. I found myself crafting stories to cover up where I had been late recordings, editing deadlines, errands that never really existed. Michael never challenged me, but his silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of indifference, but the silence of a man who was watching, waiting, perhaps even hoping I would confess. One evening, as I was leaving to meet Adrian, Michael asked, "Who makes you smile like that?" I froze at the doorway, the question sharp as a blade. I turned, forcing a laugh, forcing my lips to move. "No one," I said too quickly. His eyes held mine, and for the first time in years, there was anger there. Not explosive, not loud, just the quiet fury of someone who knew the truth but couldn't bear to speak it aloud. With Adrian, the passion only deepened. We spent nights tangled in each other, whispering promises neither of us were brave enough to keep. He told me he loved me once, his voice breaking as though the words cost him something to say. I kissed him to silence him, but inside, those words sank into me, dangerous and intoxicating. I had never heard Michael say them with that kind of rawness. I wondered if he ever would again, yet the walls of secrecy were closing in. Michael began to ask more questions, subtle at first. He checked my phone once I caught him, his hand trembling as he scrolled. He put it down before I could say anything, and we never spoke of it, but I knew he had seen enough to confirm his suspicions. The silence between us was no longer numb, it was sharp, brittle, ready to break. Adrian wanted me to leave. To choose him openly? "You can't live like this forever," he told me one night, his hand cupping my cheek, his eyes searching mine as though I were the only thing he wanted in the world. I wanted to believe him, to run into his life without looking back, but marriages don't unravel cleanly. They shatter in slow motion, each piece cutting as it falls. I began to live in two worlds, the one where I was a wife, quietly going through the motions of dinners, conversations, and the facade of normalcy, and the one where I was alive, where my body and soul belonged to a man who wasn't my husband. Each world demanded something of me, and each world left me emptier than the other. The breaking point came one evening when I returned home later than usual. Michael was waiting in the living room, a half-empty bottle beside him, his eyes tired but sharp. "Do you love him?" he asked, his voice steady, almost calm. My breath caught. The words hung between us like a confession neither of us could take back. My lips trembled, and before I could force the lie, a single tear slid down my cheek. That was my answer. Michael stood slowly, the weight of years in his shoulders. He didn't shout, didn't rage. He simply walked past me upstairs, leaving me standing in the wreckage of everything we had built. For the first time, I saw not indifference, but devastation. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, my mind spinning between guilt and desire, between a marriage crumbling and a love affair that burned too brightly to survive the daylight. And I realized with terrifying clarity that no matter what choice I made, I was going to break someone, maybe even myself. The days that followed blurred into a haze of dread and desire. Michael barely spoke to me, though he remained in the house. He moved quietly, his presence a constant reminder of the truth he now carried inside him. I found myself reaching for words that never came, apologies that seemed too hollow, explanations that felt too fragile to withstand the weight of what I had done. He had stopped asking questions, and that silence was worse than any confrontation could have been. Adrian, on the other hand, became more insistent. He wanted me to leave, to stop hiding in shadows, to stop sneaking around as if what we had was something shameful. He said my eyes betrayed me, that when I was with him, he could see the real me, the woman who laughed, who wanted, who burned. And he wasn't wrong. In his arms, I wasn't the careful, cautious version of myself I'd become over years of compromise. I was alive, reckless, unafraid. But every time he asked me to choose, I faltered. One night, Michael and I ended up in the same room for dinner, the silence unbearable. He poured himself a drink and finally looked at me, not past me, not through me, but at me. "Do you remember when we used to talk until the sun came up?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft, almost nostalgic. My throat tightened. "Yes," I whispered. He took a slow sip, then nodded. "I don't know when we stopped. Maybe that's when I lost you." His words cut deeper than any accusation. He didn't rage. He didn't blame. He simply mourned, and that was worse. Later that week, Adrian pressed again. "You can't live in pieces," he told me as we lay together, our bodies tangled in the heat of another stolen night. "Every day you stay there, you lose more of yourself. You don't belong to him anymore, you belong here with me." His lips brushed mine, his hands tracing the lines of my skin like I was his salvation, and for a moment I believed him. But then the image of Michael sitting alone at the dinner table haunted me. The man who had once been my entire world. Reduced to silence and whiskey. The fracture between my two lives widened until it could no longer hold. One evening, I returned home to find Michael waiting again, but this time, there was no bottle, no quiet resignation. His eyes were clear and his voice steady. "I need to know if you're staying or if you've already left." He wasn't asking about my body, he was asking about my soul. The honesty of it broke something in me. I wanted to tell him I was sorry, that I would fight for us, that I would choose him. But the words stuck, because deep down I wasn't sure they would be true. Adrian's pull grew unbearable. He began talking about the future apartments we could share, trips we could take, a life where we didn't have to hide. I wanted that dream, but I also knew dreams weren't free. They came at the cost of destruction. One night when I tried to pull away, to tell him I wasn't ready, he kissed me so fiercely it stole the protest from my lips. "Don't go back to him," he whispered against my skin. "Every time you walk out that door, you break us both." His desperation mirrored my own, and I found myself sinking into him again, unable to stop. But the collision I'd been avoiding finally came. Michael called me one afternoon, his voice calm but cold. "Don't bother coming home tonight," he said. "I know where you'll be." My chest constricted, fear and sorrow twisting together. He had followed me, or maybe he didn't need to, maybe he simply knew me too well. When I arrived at Adrian's place that night, shaken, he pulled me into his arms. But before I could explain, there was a knock at the door. My blood ran cold. Adrian froze, sensing the storm on the other side. When he opened it, Michael stood there, his expression unreadable. The silence between the two men was suffocating. "I just want the truth," Michael said, his eyes never leaving mine. "Say it to my face, tell me you love him." My lips parted, trembling, but the words caught. Adrian's hand tightened around mine, urging me, begging me to choose. Michael's gaze burned into me, waiting, demanding Dot. In that moment, I realized there was no escaping the wreckage. No matter what I said, someone's heart would break beyond repair. The truth clawed at my throat, heavy and merciless, and still, I stood there, paralyzed, my silence speaking louder than anything I could confess.